started beekeeping in about 2002, 2003, and we worked in a lot of commercial and migratory beekeeping operations. I'm going to tell you a lot more about that. According to his extensive writings, which you can find online, he won his first 6 hives in a poker game. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about that story. I'm kind of curious to hear myself. Through all his various experiences in commercial and migratory beekeeping, he had various realizations, all of which kind of led him to understand that the bees know how to take care of themselves better than we do. That's not really a surprise. They've been doing it a lot longer than we have. So he tries to carry that sort of idea and philosophy into his beekeeping management style. And I imagine he's going to tell us a little bit about that as well. Sam works primarily with top bar hives and also more recently ORA hives. So hear a little bit about his work with those different types of hives. So I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm going to give it over to Sam. Take it away.
All right. Hey, I'm in Philadelphia. This is great. I call it my hometown. I grew up about 6-7 miles from here over in Cherry Hill. It's great. So it's great to be on home turf, and it seems just Philadelphia just seems a great place to keep bees. It's awesome, but. See, I gotta admit to everybody, I'm not really a beekeeper anymore, I'm a bartender. Yeah, it's gotta be full of that this afternoon. Yeah, you're gonna hear a lot of bee puns that never get old for me. But, yeah, winning 6 hives in a poker game, that didn't really happen. That's just the best story I've come up with. It wasn't that easy for me. Really, I was in upstate New York. I was getting really interested in the permaculture books, which is a permanent agriculture system, working with natural cycles that have a more perennial kind of agriculture, more forest gardening, and something more sustainable. It's a lot less work, but follows natural cycles rather than trying to control them. And I read this book called The One Straw Revolution by Matsunobu Fukuoka. And he's a no-till rice farmer in Japan, and he coined this term of do-nothing farming, just realizing that these living things just have inherent worth, and letting them grow, you can still have a profitable farm without all the controls. On the first page of that book, he says, "We know nothing, we will never know anything." And that kind of resonated with me. It made a lot of sense. So I wanted to go into some kind of agriculture, and turns out I made friends who knew beekeepers, commercial beekeepers who needed help. But, you know, the first thing I learned is that the bees aren't doing well. So we got this relationship, as you see up here, people and bees and people. What's going on there? Well, the way I see it, it's not CCD, not colony collapse disorder. It's more like PCD, people collapse disorder. It seems our problems are more just the exemplary of this rift between the way that we live in our society today and the way that the natural world works, the way that ecosystems have always evolved to be. And we're just seem to be kind of messing things up, you know? Well, it used to be the only question that I ever got was, do you ever get stung? It got really boring after a while. I came up with a long list of answers, you know, only when I wear the bullseye, or only when I get out of the truck, or only when the boss says go get stung, or only by the IRS. But these days, since the bee story got big in the media, the only question is, what's going on with the bees? How can we help the bees? It's a total renaissance, you know, looking at the natural world on a mass media scale. And it's fantastic. We get a lot of support these days. And I've got a lot of opinions on what is actually going on with the bees. But for the short answer, for those folks just making chit-chat, I tell them that the bees are, you know, pissed off. I don't like to anthropomorphize the bees, but that's it in a nutshell. You know, they don't like the way that we're treating the soil and the way that they're being managed. It used to be they were always treated as divine creatures in every other culture. Now they're just like livestock. So this is some of the first things I learned when I first got into the bee world. This is kind of where I got started, working for Honey Gardens Apiaries. It was a 1,000 hive stay-at-home operation. You know, we harvested honey, kept it totally raw, and we did a line of plant medicine products, an elderberry syrup and a propolis throat spray. It was really amazing. But the very first hive that I opened, I pulled out a frame, and I saw this stuff in there, plastic. And it just didn't make any sense. Like, really? This is what we're doing to the bees? And I heard, immediately on my first day, it's like the bees aren't doing well. They aren't thriving like they used to. And of course, I got all stung up that first day. I think I got stung 5 times in the neck before I even got my first veil on, and I freaked out a little bit, and I ran out of the bee yard, and the bees chased me a little while. I went some distance away, and they started to calm down, and I sat down. I was looking up at this blue sky and this beautiful green Vermont field on this spring day, and I waited to see if I was going to die. But I didn't die, and somehow I made it through that first day, and for some reason I came back the next day, and at that point I was hooked, you know. At this point I can't do anything else. I have all these bee tattoos, and I'm locked in. But it was totally bewildering, just like learning the intricacies of the hive while working for this business. And I was up there for only a couple of months when it seemed that all my friends were moving to Brooklyn. I decided to move to Montana. I called a couple of people out there, and I got a job with a beekeeper. Oh, well, before I did that, this is where I lived, in Vermont. They said I could park my van out back of the honey house, and I spray painted some jugs black so I had a hot shower every afternoon. And you know, for those of you folks who want to be commercial beekeepers, while you're learning the ropes and figuring out how to keep your bees alive, this might be where you're living. But I'm here today to tell you that it can be done, you know. I run a viable business now. I take care of 400 some hives, and things are really good. When the weather's good, it's really good, but it's totally self-sustaining for me these days. It's great. I don't live in a van anymore. It's fun. I liked it. But I moved out to Montana, and I got a job with a beekeeper out of the phone book my first day there. And I signed up for this 5,000 hive operation called Anarchy Apiaries north of Missoula. And it was totally different. We had 4 hives on a pallet. We picked these pallets up with forklifts, loaded them onto a semi-truck, 500 hives in a semi with a giant net over them, and we shipped them down to California to pollinate the almond orchards. We rented them out to the almonds for a couple weeks, then gathered them up, shipped them up to Washington to pollinate the apples, and then back home to Montana to pollinate all the cherry orchards around Flathead Lake. Then through the rest of the summer they would go on to make a honey crop. But I learned that these beekeepers barely broke even, if that, harvesting honey, because 80-some% of the honey comes in from China and Argentina, and they can't even make a living doing it at this scale. So they were making their money doing migratory pollination and having lots of trouble trying to keep their bees alive in this system. You know, these days the public wants to blame these commercial beekeepers for stressing out the bees and causing these collapses. The commercial beekeepers want to point their fingers at chemical companies that are spreading all these toxins in the environment, whereas really it's the general public that is being duped into supporting this farming system that is poisoning and malnourishing the bees. And really, I run Anarchy Apiaries. I'm an anarchist. I don't tell the general public what to do. I don't make rules for other people or other beekeepers. So I decided that the only way that I could see out of it was for me to go off and do my own thing. And I was different than these commercial guys because they have grower contracts to support. They really are providing the pollination that enables the most of food production in this country. They got payrolls to meet. They have families to support. They feel that their hands are tied. They can't take losses on such a scale. They can't stop treating or medicating or feeding their bees. What was happening in these bee yards is that from going from one monocrop to the next, monocultures have all just one kind of plant. So if a certain pest likes that plant, this pest can grow unlimitedly. So these monocrops are sprayed pretty intensively. And of course, the bees don't get diverse nutrition in a monocrop. So from one farm to the next, these farms are just poisoning and malnourishing them. Plus the stress of being on the road. These beekeepers' bees are dying all the time. So what they want are bees that grow all the time, so they can constantly split them off and replace their dying numbers. And most of the USDA breeding programs and the university breeding programs are geared towards building this better bee, a bee that grows all the time, so they can be split off and keep these commercial beekeepers in business. Now, a hive that grows all the time also needs supplemental feeding. They don't shut down in times of dearth. They turn all that nectar into more brood, more bees. And if they're growing all the time, they also are growing parasites all the time, so they need to be medicated. And that's led us to this state that the beekeeping industry is in right now. They're like welfare bees. You know, it's not really conducive to folks who want to have a couple hives in their backyard and keep them alive with minimal inputs. So it's pretty rough shape, but constant work. These beekeepers are the hardest working, most innovative people that I've ever met. You know, I'd never worked so hard in my life. You would never miss a feeding, and you would never miss a time to medicate, because if you did, the next time you visited your bee yard, you might not have any bees left. It was rough. So this is how we move bees with a swinger forklift. This is in the Jaco River Valley. You know, a hydraulic off-road, high-powered forklift, and this is how I moved a lot of my bees on top of the Subaru. I was a little bit different out there, a little more low-key, but these days I move a lot of hives with a Honda CT90. It's 10 years older than I am. It's 100 miles to the gallon. If you want to be more sustainable in your bee operation, yeah, I could recommend one of these. Pretty fun. So you can just picture what it's like in the Central Valley of California. I remember looking down this row of hives in the almond groves, and I knew there were 1,400 hives in this straight row. 3 guys go down this row. The first guy pops the lid and sets it aside to expose the plastic trough feeder. The middle guy comes with a gasoline nozzle that hooks up to a 300-gallon tank of corn syrup, pumps all these feeders full, and the third guy comes and closes up the lids. By the time the third guy got there, those hives had been kicked a couple times, and the third guy got stung up pretty good. That always seemed to be me, you know. But some of these hives would take 15 gallons of syrup just to keep them alive through the winter, and it was amazing how intense and how much work had to happen just to keep bees alive in this kind of feedlot beekeeping system. And I've always refrained from judging these people for doing what they have to do. I don't say that their kind of beekeeping is wrong and my kind of beekeeping I do now is right. There is no right or wrong in my world. There's no good or evil. But what I do see and how I make my decisions is I see monotony and I see diversity. And I know that bees thrive on diversity, so I try to support diversity everywhere I go and have a healthier world for our bees. So this is what I thought was going on. They were in rough shape and just calling out for a different kind of approach. But I stuck it out there for about 2 years doing migratory pollination, working at minimum wage, and I was really learning a whole lot about bee biology and what people did to keep them alive in this system and keep their hives alive. So while I was in Montana, I got a call from my old boss in Vermont. His bees were crashing. In the fall of 2004, he crashed down about 500 hives from his 1,000 colonies. And what he decided to do was gather them all up by hand. He didn't have a forklift. Load them on a semi-truck, and he shipped them down to South Carolina, to the Tupelo swamps, to hopefully give them a milder winter and an earlier spring build-up to save his bees and save his bee business. He couldn't find anyone to manage the operation. Nobody wants to get stung. There's not a lot of money in it, but I like getting stung. I opened up with that story about getting all stung up. It's not to intimidate you new beekeepers. Getting stung is my favorite part of keeping bees. If you don't get stung, the honey doesn't taste as sweet, right? So I said, sure, I'll do it. I'll take him over. And he stressed the fact that I was going to be all alone. So okay, let's go. He dropped me off there in the spring 2005 into eastern South Carolina there, and I started going through the hives he had brought down. And it turns out another half of them had died. About 250 of the hives were left. He had lost about 3/4 of his operation at that point. He had a checkmite strip in every hive. Checkmite is coumaphos. It's an organophosphate. It's nerve gas, basically, developed in World War II to kill people, and is meant as a miticide to kill the varroa mites. Well, I went to some of these hives. I pulled out a checkmite strip, and there were varroa mites crawling up and down on the strip that was meant to kill them. They were totally resistant. So these mites, they breed every 2 weeks inside the brood. The female goes in there, she lays a male offspring, then several female offsprings. They inbreed inside that cell and then hatch out about 2 weeks later and jump into another cell. So they mutate very quickly. They develop resistance to this really toxic stuff. Nowadays we know that one of those checkmite strips has enough active coumaphos to kill a human. So we didn't know that back then. It was rough. It was all over the place. So I was looking around at these bees. I was 24 years old at the time. I was responsible for millions of little lives. And I didn't really know what I was doing, by any means. Called up the boss and said, these bees are going backwards. It's looking very dire here, and I don't know what we're going to do. The next day, 12 liters of formic acid showed up on my doorstep. And this is before Mite 2 or the gel products that are now on the market for formic acid that are a bit safer. But I figured out how to mix the solution down and get some butcher pads and dip them in this formic acid solution and lay them on tops of the beehives. I put some, while I was holding my breath, you know. And I put some sticky boards, some sheets of paper on the bottoms of the hives and pulled them out 24 hours later. And there were rows of these varroa mites that had fallen off the bees. There were thousands of mites that had been killed. That formic acid also killed a bunch of the queens. It killed a bunch of brood and young bees. It was pretty devastating stuff. It killed the mites as well. Suddenly the bees weren't going backwards anymore, and the brood was starting to clear up, and at least some of them started coming ahead. And we didn't have any queens ordered, you know. Most commercial beekeepers buy their queens and they get shipped to them in little cages. They come from the southern states or California or Hawaii, and that's for maximizing production. You can take a few of the bees, a little bit of brood, give them a mated queen, and they take right off. Otherwise, you know, you let bees swarm and they'll raise their own queen. So I was talking with the boss and he said, oh, you can just make splits with eggs, you know, and they'll raise their own queen. And I was looking around, we barely had a hive that was strong enough to do that with. They weren't ready to swarm, they were just recuperating. I hooked up with a couple local beekeepers in that area, and I pretty much taught myself how to raise queen bees with the grafting technique. In grafting, you pick up a larva with a little tiny tool, like a dental tool. You pick up the larva and put it into a queen cell cup. And you put this cup into a very strong queenless hive, and they'll draw it out into a queen cell. And you can raise 50 or 60 or even 100 queen cells per hive, per cell-raising hive this way. So then you can disperse those queen cells right before they hatch to your mating nukes or your splits that you make, and really speed up the production rather than letting each hive raise their own queen. That takes about 3 weeks, you know, of no eggs being laid if hives are left to their own devices. So these are some of the first queen cells that I had ever grafted. I started doing it with a paper clip in the cab of the truck, and I learned a lot of things the hard way. You know, you don't use sunlight to light the larva while you're grafting. It just fries them. And it was pretty tough for a while for me to get any queen cells started. You can see the cow skull on the left here, like the death's head imagery, is how things were going to that point. But then the tupelo bloom came on, and to this day, it's probably one of the most intense honey flows I've ever seen. It was amazing how the bees started to grow all of a sudden. The queen cells started getting accepted, and these virgin queens were flying out and coming back mated and started to lay eggs, and it was working. I was built up the next day, and by the start of May, I had honey guards back up to 1,000 hives through the constant work. So we gathered them up, shipped them back north, put them right on the dandelion. They exploded. They went on that year in 2005. Some of these resistance that were seemed to be coping with it. Spring in 2005 was the last time. So I did some queen raising experiments through the summer there in Vermont, and I was dipping the pads, and I got a hole in one of my gloves. And that formic acid burned the top layer of skin off 2 of my fingers. They got better. Them into winter and special in these genetics, and I wanted to continue to start my own business. I decided to go back to work for commercial beekeepers. But I had a couple of, oh yeah, here we go. Probably a bunch of you have seen this site before. I ventured to Florida. I worked for Dave Mendes, but it was just devastating down in the southern states. Beehive down there, there's all kinds of problems. There's also a whole bunch of potential. These bees make nectar and pollen pretty much all year long. And if you can handle these problems and keep them under control, I mean, you can really raise a lot of bees down there. I was there for a couple months, and then I decided to go back out to California and Idaho and Montana to work for Anarchy Apiaries again. And I decided to lease 100 hives from them, now that I knew the ropes a little bit. And I went back to Vermont the following spring to see what I had left. I think 12 of my hives had survived there, and I was ecstatic about it. I took the 6 best breeder queens. I put them with their own bees into little cardboard nuke boxes, little 5-frame cardboard boxes, and I drove them from Vermont to Montana. About halfway through the second day, those bees were chewing through the cardboard boxes, and my little Subaru was filling up with bees. But I made it there, and I put those 6 little hives into a canyon, isolated from all the other commercial bees that I was working with at the time, and I kept them separate. And I started raising queens off of them. And the 100 hives that I was leasing, I split them into 200 with some of the queens I raised. I went on to go on full queen production that year. I was grafting 2,000 cells a week, and I made a little bit of a honey crop. And that next spring, I went with the rest of the Anarchy Apiaries bees with those 200 hives I had, and we went to California almonds for renting them for pollination. And suddenly, I was rich. I made like 60 or 70 grand that year. It was ridiculous. And I didn't have the overhead that the most beekeepers had. I was under the wing of Anarchy Apiaries, using their trucks, their honey extracting equipment, and their pollination contracts. And that's basically what my income was. But I had sold my life away, you know, working their bees and my own bees at any free time that I had. And my buddies looked at me with all this money that I was making, and they said, "You gotta spend all this money, you know, you're self-employed. You're gonna have to pay it all back to the government if you don't do something." It's like, geez, I didn't really know how to spend money, you know. I'd been at minimum wage for, you know, the several years before that. And so I bought, you know, my truck, I bought thousands of frames, and I bought every gadget and gizmo and every beekeeping catalog I could find. I took a business trip to Hawaii to visit the queen producers out there. And at the end of the year, I still had to give a whole bunch of money back, and I decided it wasn't worth it. This whole expand or die model was not for me. It's not where my interests were. So I was totally burnt out on this whole industrial beekeeping model. I didn't want to support that kind of farming anymore. I had some money that I could go off on my own and see if I could keep bees alive without treatments. I was wondering what to do, where to go. And suddenly, colony collapse disorder hits the media, you know, and pretty much, if you ask me, it's just one beekeeper finally spoke up and said, "Hey, my bees look like crap." It kind of broke the ice. You know, the beekeeping world's a very small industry, maybe 24 major players on there, and you know, there's a lot of politics, a lot of egos and stuff, but for finally someone to say, and stand up and say that if things aren't going well, then everyone else gets to rise up and also say, "Hey, we're having a really hard time here." And it became a national phenomenon. I thought it was just a flash in the pan. I was like, "Oh, this is going to be really nice for me to start a business." But it just seems to be getting bigger and bigger every year. It's fantastic, the amount of support we get these days. So I decided to get rid of the 200 hives that I was running and just keep my 6 best breeder queens that were still in the canyon in Montana. I decided to get them off of the foundation. Like I was talking before about like monotony and diversity. Foundation, this hexagon imprinted stuff. This has always felt like to me to be monoculture inside the beehive. And rather than treating my bees for the things that I saw, I wanted to take the stress off of them in any way that I could to let them find their own resilience once again. Because bees aren't like any other part of agriculture. They've never really been messed with until about the 850s. And I think beneath the surface in every hive is still this wildness, this resilience, the ability to cope with everything. They've been doing it for a long time. So, you know, I had heard of the small cell theories before. It was really when I was in South Carolina, and we had very little comb to work with, and I was trying to expand the numbers when working for honey gardens down there. And the bees, a lot of them hadn't been worked in a long time. It was very hard to frames. They were all propolized together. I wanted to go to 9 frames in a 10-frame brood box, make them that easier to work, a lot easier to get in there and rate queens and do a breeding program. And the boss said, sure, it was fine. I was running the show. We had brought them back up north and thrown the honey supers on when later in June, the boss came to me and I talked to some of my buddies, and we got to go back to 10 frames. 9 frames is a terrible idea, it'll make a mess. So I fought with him on it for a while, and he said, no, I got the foundation ready to go. I'm dropping it, so we had to pull off all the supers and drop in these frames. And so when I was arguing, I did some research on the internet to find the difference between 9 and 10 frames and what people were doing out there. And I read about this wingnut in Nebraska named Mite, who was shaving down his end bars and putting 11 frames in a frame box. And the content was like, why are you doing that? He says, well, I have smaller cell bees, and the combs are a little bit narrower as well. Smaller cell bees. So I read all of his writings, which you can find at bushfarms.com. And I read D. Lusby's writings, who was the small cell guru. Her writing you can find on beesource.com. And that was my introduction to small cell, but it wasn't until these several years later that I started to implement it in my own hives. So I got the foundation out of my bees, and I started measuring some of the cells, and they weren't really small at all. The 5.4 millimeter standard size foundation, you know, I got rid of that, and I was measuring cells, and they were about 5.3, maybe 5.2. Not anywhere close to that 4.9 millimeters that the lust bees were claiming would keep the mites below threshold level. And the lust bees were 6th generation beekeepers, or the leaders of the small cell movement here, and they are the only beekeepers who never treated their bees for varroa mites, or the only commercial beekeepers who never had to treat. In the late 80s when varroa came over, people were having a lot of problems, and nobody wanted to treat. You know, it was taboo to put any kind of substance into a beehive. These days it's almost taboo not to. You get a lot of scorn if you're a treatment-free beekeeper. But the lust bees, you know, had all this old equipment hanging around on their farm in Arizona, and they had a bunch of foundation mills. And when people were having problems, they looked at these foundation mills and realized they were all different cell sizes through the years. And they went to the USDA lab in Tucson and asked, what's up with these different cell sizes? And the lab didn't know a thing about it. Nobody knew a thing about it. And they did some research and realized that A.I. Root did write about, you know, upsizing the bees, making them larger, bigger tongues, thinking bigger bees would make more honey. Bigger is better, you know? 1877 was when A.I. Root started upsizing the bees. And it, you know, went well for like a long time until, you know, these mites came over and seemed to take advantage of this oversized bee. So the lust bees started forcing their bees to go smaller, with sequentially smaller foundations, until they came to this number of 4.9 that is what they claim has caused their success. Of course, the industry turned their back on the lust bees, saying that they're crazy, that they're isolated in the desert, and mostly that they have Africanized bees that are resistant naturally to the varroa mites. And to this day, most of the industry is in denial that you can keep commercial bees alive and without treatments. Well, Dee Lusby, she turned her back on the industry and started the Organic Beekeeping Yahoo list, which you can go online now and find it. It's a great forum and support for treatment-free beekeeping. And it's got 5,000 some members. It's like a virtual army we have. And you cannot go on this list and talk about any kinds of treatments whatsoever. No sugar dusting, drone trapping, any of that, because you'll get booted right off. But it's pretty neat, and she's the one that did it. And so we homage her, and she runs an organic beekeeping meetup up there in Arizona. It starts in March, and we do one in Massachusetts now in August, and there's one in Florida that goes on. So it's really created this movement of us, all who are doing no treatments. And we don't use the word organic because, for one thing, we can't guarantee that the bees are foraging on our organic treatments. I mean, there are certification agencies that will certify you, but you need about a 2-mile radius with no roads, no train tracks, no power lines, no schools, no spraying of any kind whatsoever, and it's virtually impossible to find in this country. So the organic honey that you see in Whole Foods and those places all comes in from Brazil. And besides, that organic word also would allow for essential oils or the organic acids and things like that. This treatment-free movement relies on the genetics of the stronger bees, this natural and smaller cell comb, and just, you know, letting bees find their own balance. And that's the solidarity that we found and how we go forward. And there's a lot of precedents now of the beekeepers who aren't treating their bees and are on a commercial scale. It's pretty great. So I was in Montana with these 6 hives, and I decided that if I want to really build up my business and move back to the Northeast and start doing some education and build my numbers up and see if I could just do it first, I could go back down to Florida and really build up my numbers. I knew the pests down there, so that's what I decided to do. And it turns out I hooked up eventually with some New Jersey beekeepers down there in Florida, Harvey's Honey. And they were looking for a queen raiser, just someone who would raise queen cells and cage queens. So I raised queens for the Harveys, who run about 4,000 hives in South Jersey. They're about 20 miles from where I grew up. And all I did was just raise these cells, and I lived in their mating yard with 800 5-frame nukes, like there. And I could turn a blind eye to all the medicating and feeding and moving that I didn't want anything to do with. But these 800 5-frame nukes Every 3 weeks, I would go in there, I would steal the queen, and drop in a queen cell. And these bees survived without any treatments of any kind, because every 3 weeks, I was breaking the brood cycle. When you break the brood cycle in a hive, you're removing the queen, and it's at least a week or more until that new queen will go get mated and come back and lay eggs. So the mites are emerging from with the emerging bees at that time, and then they have no larvae to jump right back in, and they're exposed to the bees' grooming behavior, and they have no place to hide at that point. So by breaking this brood cycle, the brood looked like this. It was great. This has no treatments of any kind. This is solid, nice-looking brood. And I realized that bees do this on their own. If you do nothing in your beehive, the bees have the tools that they need to stay alive, and their swarming behavior. The old queen leaves, and in that case, there's about 3 weeks of no eggs being laid. And if we just were to, step back a little bit and let our bees swarm, I mean, they'd totally be on healthy footing. Of course, that is half of your bees flying out into the woods, and meanwhile, the hive that you keep already has 3 weeks of loss of production. So commercial beekeepers are not in a place where they can allow this to happen. So I was thinking about my business name as I was down there in Florida. This is not something I ended up adopting, but so I was down in Florida working for the Harveys, who are really great beekeepers and really supportive of me. And I had these 6 hives, and at that time, small cell foundation became available on the market. So I bought some wax small cell foundation. I got a round of that through my 6 hives. And that did force them to be even a little bit smaller. And at the same time, I started splitting up those 6 hives in 2006. And I busted those 6 hives into about 160 3-frame nukes. That sounds like a lot of bees, but really it's just, you take a single Langstroth deep, and I put 2 sheets of masonite in there, and I had 3 little baby hives. So it was only 50-some deep boxes, about a pickup truck load. I made some calls up into the Hudson Valley, where I had a lot of friends, and suddenly I had 15 bee yards of people who wanted to host bees. It's the time of CCD, everyone wanted to be part of it and help out the beekeepers. So it was fantastic. I had these 160-some nukes, and I brought them up the coast, and I set them on the dandelion flow. And I realized what I could do with my breeding program. I raised the daughter queens from this stock that I had brought from South Carolina to Vermont to Montana and now to Florida. They open mated down in Florida. They were northern hardy, resistant mother queens, but they had mated with whatever drones were out there. They were Florida drones. Who knew what they could be? But I realized in bee breeding, the drones only have 1 set of chromosomes. The drones are a genetic duplicate of their queen. Drones don't have fathers. So I could bring these bees that mated in the south up, and those hives would be producing pure northern drones. As long as I didn't raise any queens from those hives, then I could keep the stock pure by importing some northern hardy stuff to mate with those drones. So I called up my friends. I called up Kirk Webster, who has been a mentor and friend of mine who does treatment-free Russian bee breeding in Vermont. I contacted some other members of the Russian Bee Breeders Association who weren't treating their bees, and I got some queens from Michael Bush. And these days, Michael and I are really good friends, and I tell him, like I called him a wingnut before, that's the highest compliment I could pay anybody. So, and I started doing some bee removals around in New York, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, all as to incorporate new families to mate with the drones that I had been working with for a couple years. And I was looking around at these 160 nukes, and they were really clean. I had broken up the brood cycle a couple of times, and they started bubbling out the fronts of the hives, and I looked around and realized I didn't have another frame, another box, or any room to give these bees at all. So I had to think quick, and I decided to start building my own boxes and shaking the bees into top bar hives. I had never seen one before. I had heard about them through the Peace Corps efforts that had started in the 70s. And I knew I wanted some hive that was going to be still inspectable, so I could keep raising queens. And it was something that I could just do simply. So I didn't know really how to do it, but I started dipping a piece of yarn in beeswax and laying that on the middle of this bar, thinking they would take that little wax ridge and start their combs off of that and stay straight on these bars. Well, I shook my first dozen nukes into a top bar hive, and I came back a week later to see what had happened. I couldn't get the bar up for some reason. I couldn't get the next one up. And I was looking around, and I picked up the 4 bars at once and looked at the bottom of the hive and out front, and they had chewed all the wax off the yarn, chewed up the yarn, spat it out the front of the hive, and then started their combs right on the edge of each top bar, perfectly in between the two, so I could not get them apart anymore. I said, oh well. But what I decided to do was start cutting grooves in these bars and gluing in popsicle sticks to give them this wooden ridge. And from that point on, problems have been relatively minimal. And I say relatively minimal. I think Winnie the Pooh said it best: you never can tell with bees. So I had to cut 5,000 top bars last fall, and I had to eat 20,000 popsicles. So I was designing these boxes, and I realized that D. Lusby told me something once, that bees only need 4 things. They need clean air, clean water, clean food, and a clean home. That's it. Dimensions aren't important. It doesn't matter. In a top bar hive such as this, there is one dimension that is important. That's the width of these bars. And I use 1.25 inches. So, and that keeps them, it tends to keep them straight in the brood nest, but things can get a little crazy in the honey area, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So I was amazed at the expansion of these hives in their first year, and it's something I had seen when I went foundationless in my Langstroth hives too. It seems that bees build natural comb faster than they will draw out foundation. Foundation, you might think that you're helping out the bees, but in the wild, bees do not draw comb off of a 2-dimensional surface like that. They like to cluster on both sides of the wax and draw it down and heat it as they go. So I think natural comb does get built faster than foundations. And as I was building these hives and starting to do everything myself, I realized the real mission of Anarchy Apiaries, which is to bring the means of production back to the beekeeper. All right, let's go back to before 1851. Most of the hives out there were skeps, straw baskets, or gums, hollow logs. And everyone made their own beehives. There were bees everywhere. Every farm, every church, every school. There's just so many bees, but the bees were basically wild. You can't go into and inspect a hive like this. They'd swarm out to the woods, sometimes they'd come back. Honey was never sold. It was far too valuable to sell. It was given as gifts. It was treated as gold, And the bees were never really messed with. Until a Philadelphia minister named Lorenzo Langstroth patented the movable frame hive, which is based on the idea of bee space. Comb, 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 like that, with the proper spacing that the bees won't make connecting wax. So now suddenly, you could take apart this hive, get a comb of honey, and put it into a spinner, giant centrifuge, spin the honey out of it, and save the wax year after year. And that way, the bees don't have to make new wax every year. In a hive like this, you would either kill off the hives or harvest a whole slab of wax with the honey in it. And the bees would have to work very hard to remake it. Now they didn't have to make new wax, and you could also suppress them from swarming by giving them room at the right time. So this enabled the whole bee industry to be born. It was the time of the Industrial Revolution. Many businesses were just budding, and suddenly this Langstroth hive enabled honey production on this massive scale. And it worked. For several decades, these record-breaking honey crops were coming in until about the 1880s or so, when all these diseases started spreading through these commercial bee yards. What we realized was happening is that the wax is lipophilic. It's like a sponge. Everything goes into the wax. We say the wax is like the liver of a beehive. All the pathogens in the hive go into the wax. All the toxins in the environment all go in there. And in nature, when the hive swarms, they go out and they make brand new wax from scratch. Or even in their parent hive, they'll tear down old wax and rebuild it, unless the beekeeper goes in there, doesn't let them swarm, and forces them to reuse their wax every year. So these contagious diseases were now being spread rapidly through these commercial bee yards, the main one being American foul brood, which is a spore-forming bacteria, highly contagious. So what the industry decided to do, in light of these diseases, was put pressure on every state government to ban fixed comb beekeeping. this cottage industry, these homesteaded hives, that what people had always made themselves and for thousands of years sustainably, now were illegal. And this step, what the public still thinks of as the image of a beehive is an illegal hive. Where I live in New York, it's been illegal since 1922. So, and this is the reason why we have bee inspectors. Every hive must be registered with the state and inspected. And really, if anything, I think the movable frame hive should be illegal, because that's what spread all the disease to begin with. But the industry was pretty self-aware and wise. It locked people into this Langstroth monopoly. Now suddenly they couldn't make their own hives, they had to buy them. And suddenly beekeeping went from this common practice to this esoteric art that it still is today. Several generations went by and pretty much all other methodology was forgotten. Until about the Peace Corps started working in third world countries to propagate a simpler hive. The top bar hives, don't take any of this precision milled lumber. As many, like to get a Langstroth hive today, it takes hundreds of dollars, and then you have to find the bees to go into it. Whereas these top bar hives are just like troughs, planters or coffins for bees. But it's something that can be made by anyone, pretty much. And when people ask me these days, how do I get into beekeeping, the first thing I tell them is don't buy anything. It's kind of a radical statement to make, and they don't understand it. But folks are gonna go to a bee supply place because they don't have any other options. And these places will sell you the frames, the really expensive frames that are really energy intensive to make, and the plastic foundation, and these bees that are shipped up from the south to shake on there, and then the lines of essential oils or acids to try to keep your hive alive and keep the mites low. And a lot of the new beekeepers today don't want to treat their bees. They just want to have bees for bees, They don't really care about making honey or anything like that. But they get these out-of-state bees shipped on up to them and shake them onto this plastic, and then they don't treat them. And it's a lot easier to start them according to their own biology than to fix things once it's gone awry. So a lot of these bees get overrun by their mites and their diseases. And it's something, because beekeepers like to say that mites killed this hive, or this disease killed, or that disease killed this hive. And they try to treat the disease, or treat the mites, and find the enemy, and nuke the enemy, and get rid of it. Whereas really, these are just the symptoms, And like Western medicine, we try to treat the symptoms, and we don't look at the lower causes. Basically, the lower cause is that the bees are out of balance. They're living on a plastic skeleton, they're not adapted to the area, they're totally stressed out. So, I realized that in doing these top bar hives that there are a lot of advantages from, putting bees in there and letting them start from scratch and doing it the way that they want to. So this is a hive that had flipped over up in New York during an ice storm, and these bars were frozen to the ground by the time I got there to wrap them up in December. This is after I set the box back up. And it gives you an idea of what the cluster looks like in a top bar hive. In my top bars, I'll tend to keep the entrance on one side. In any kind of hive, whether it's vertical or horizontal, the bees like to keep their brood nest close to their entrance. That's where they can ventilate it better. They like to keep their honey furthest from the entrance where they can guard it better. And so I keep my entrance on one side, and you see where the dark combs are where they've been raising brood, and their honey towards the back of that. So I was able to pry these bees off of the ground and then flip them back into the box, and they were still alive, below freezing, but they volunteered to go to Florida. These days, I don't drive bees up and down the coast anymore. I've got about 200 hives that stay down in Florida, and about 250 that I have wrapped up in New York, and I do the moving around. So things have been pretty good. So I knew I wanted to at that point, I wanted to build my numbers still, and I knew I could go down to Florida and keep the gene pool pure for the northern bees by just using drones from southern bees. So I knew I needed either smaller hives or a bigger truck. And I didn't want to get a bigger truck, so I started messing around with some smaller mating nuke options. And I was keeping some little 6-inch flower pots, little terracotta pots with little baby top bars in them, just as little mating nukes I could drop cells into. And they were really cute, and they worked. But they would just fill up too quickly and I couldn't keep up with them. You know, they're about the size of those little styrofoam nuke boxes that a lot of queen producers use. But it ended up being too much work, and this is what I ended up doing with them, eating them all. But what I decided to do was find a plywood option that aligned with the other dimensions that I was working with. So this is kind of like a magic trick, right? Making a beehive appear before your eyes. There you go. That's it. So this is a pink one, that's one of their baby colors, their baby hives. So I like this picture because it's a good example of the dimensions that I use. Like I said, the dimensions aren't important, but I decided to build a box that you can take a Langstroth frame. Like so, you can pull off these end bars, pull off the bottom bar, and trim the comb back, and then the edges of this Langstroth bar sit right on the corners of my top bar box, like that, so you can convert them easily that way. This is a picture, you can see the Langstroth top bar that's resting on the edges of this box. Why would you want to do that and ruin all your nice Langstroth frames? Well, when I moved back to New York about 5 years ago, I started a little county club in Dutchess County, the Beekeepers Association of Northern Dutchess, the band. And at the first meeting, I showed some video of working top bar hives. And at the end of the meeting, this 80-year-old woman named Anne came up, and she was in tears. She gave me a hug, because now she could start keeping bees again. She had just come to the meeting out of curiosity. She had to give it up about 15 years ago because the boxes were too heavy. Or, you know how heavy Langstroth boxes are, you know. These days, my back's in really good shape. I don't do that heavy lifting anymore. So one of the main advantages of a top bar hive is that there's no heavy lifting. You're not stacking up supers. I can go into the brood nest of these hives at any time of year, you know, without having to pull off the honey. So it definitely an advantage. For another thing, I build this box right here out of rough cut boards for about $5 of lumber. I use rough cut 1x10s and just screw them together really simple as possible, you know. But every time I go to the lumber yard, I bring them a jar of honey. They give me like twice what I pay for, so it's a good deal. So it's much more economically, it's a lot easier to set one of these things up. Another advantage is, in working a hive like this, your inspection might just be you move this divider board back a little bit. You see that the bees need another bar, you give them a couple more bars and close them up. It's not like popping the lid on a Langstroth hive and everyone's looking at you at once saying, what do you think you're doing here? The bees stay really mellow. I never wear a veil anymore. I rarely use smoke. And it's just like very enjoyable to work bees. One of the things that makes it really enjoyable is that if you do inspect this whole hive, you can pick up your first comb, look at it. Don't go like this, because the whole thing might go like that. But you can go like this, and you can flip the whole thing over. You put your comb back here. The whole rest of the hive does not know it's being looked at, yet you're not letting the atmosphere out of the hive. And then your next comb, you can pick up, look at it, then you can touch the edges here and slide down. And the next one you look at, you just touch the edges and then slide down. Any bees that are on the sides of these bars get pushed down, and you never mash a bee. It's great. It's not like taking apart a Langstroth hive and trying to stack it back up. You mash bees all over the place, and feelings get hurt, and it's a bad deal. So in a hive like this, it's really easy to inspect, and the bees stay mellow, and I can work these hives faster than I can Langstroth hives. I can pick up 4 combs at once, get right into the middle, I can find queens, and then close them right back up. It's kind of a piece of cake, so it's a really nice method. So in raising queens, and I mean I've been raising queens as long as I've been keeping bees, but doing it in top bar hives, I do several different methods. My favorite way is probably just letting the bees raise their own. And I've got some out yards that I really just go to once a year, if that, and I let the hives swarm. I hang up bait hives that I'll talk about a little at the end. But, and try to catch the swarms, but you know, hives that swarm have this broodless cycle, they raise a new queen and they get really fired up, and those are very, very healthy bees going into winter. Or I will try to catch the hives that I am actively working right before they swarm. I try to follow their biology. Right before they swarm, I'll go into the hive and try to find the queen, and I'll simulate a swarm. I'll move that queen to a new spot. I'll either do it in the bee yard, and I'll give them a little bit of brood to retain the bees, a little bit of honey, the queen, and I'll give them a couple shakes of extra bees. Most of the bees are going to fly back to their original spot, but the young bees are going to stay in that new spot. So you want to give them 4 shakes or 5 shakes of extra bees. Make sure they protect that brood. Or I will go in, I'll find the queen, I'll put her in a cage, and I'll just shake a package out of them and simulate a swarm that way. And I sell packages now produced out of that, the queen with her own bees. And meanwhile, I just let that parent hive raise its own queen. And you might get 5 combs, you might only get 2 queen cells, you might get 5 queen cells on different combs. You could have 7 or 8 different combs, each with a queen cell on it that the bees have chosen and made naturally. Often they hang off the edges of these top bar combs. So I'll either let the best queen win in that situation, or I will go in 10 days after I make this split, and I'll use those extra queen cells. Like say if you got a sick hive, all right? Say you're showing like European foul brood conditions, or snot brood as we call it, chalk brood, something like that. Commercial beekeepers will just write that hive off and let it die out or something like that. But if you only have 2 hives and one of them is sick, what you can do is start some of these natural queen cells in your good hive, and then come back 10 days later, and you'll have a comb that has one of these queen cells on it, and you can use it to re-queen your sick hive. So you can either take out that queen by pinching her head. I tend not to kill queens too much anymore. I've killed enough while on the payroll, But I might move her to a new spot, just let nature take care of it. But in this sick hive, I can move the old queen out, and I'll take this comb that has this queen cell on it, I'll just drop the whole comb into that hive. Or I just might cage a queen in a little healthy nuke to sell to a beekeeper, and then drop this comb with a queen cell on it to re-queen it. So don't need to do any grafting or anything like really intensive like that. But what I realized was happening when I was doing this is that not only was I giving that sick hive new genetics and a brand new queen and a break in the brood cycle, but also I was giving them new bees, new fresh brood, and also the wax from my breeder hive. And in that wax, I realized there are 8,000 different microbes. We figured it's at least 8,000. So if a hive is successful, it is not just the genetics of the queen. You can't expect to just change a queen problems. It's how those genetics match the environment and the honey flows. Everything has to work all to try to control microbes that are. You see something like that. Grafted cell for a whole day, let them know that they're queenless, and then give them a dramatic. You can do it in the same motion. You can this comb of brood with a cell on it, because the bees that made that cell are going to protect that cell. And acceptance seems to be all in one motion. So there's another big advantage of just. And if you have multiple cells on a comb, you can go in with a knife and cut out the extra ones if you really need the queen cells. I tend not to do that much work. I'll just move the whole comb when the first one out will kill it. So, and I still, because in reality, I need new beekeepers. So it's also a good tool to, by grafting and dropping a queen cell into all those 6 hives, you've just pretty much eliminated your genetic now. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to be using queen cells in that case. Whereas if you've got maybe 20 hives and you want to make that jump to 50, I think it is a good tool if you want to really expand your numbers. Or if you want to get together as a club and share some queen cells around from some of your good local stock. So this is grafting into a top bar hive, and some of these manipulations I'm talking about, you can just do just as well in a Langstroth hive. A box is a box. I got nothing against Langstroth hives. I just, none of my friends can afford them, so I've been exploring some options to hook them up with a little less money. So in these top bars, it's just a top bar that I haven't glued the popsicle sticks in, and you can use the plastic cell cups or wax cups that you fasten to these bars. Or you can just let your hive swarm. There's a stigma against beekeepers if they let their bees swarm these days. They say they're bad beekeepers. I don't think that's the case at all. Because it's what bees want to do, and they tend to be really healthy. There's some nice swarm cells from the bottom of the comb. And every once in a while we see swarms go out that start making comb right off of trees. This is down in Florida, and this is from one of my new customers whose hive ran out of room, and they swarmed and started living in his tree on his property, and he wanted me to come out and get him down and help him do it, and I didn't get around to it, and then The next spring, that swarmed again and started growing in this other tree. And I was like, I guess you're not going to need any more bees from me. No, I guess not. So they're still there in the 20 years. And these were Russian bees. These were half Russian bees. You know, these weren't southern Africanized bees like this is. So just going wild. But this is something that you can do, you know, or even if you don't have any bees and want to get some, or even if you don't want to keep bees, you can hang up this bait hive. And a lot of these stats come from Tom Seeley at Cornell, who's done a lot of swarm behavior studies. And he says that bees like to find a 10-gallon cavity with an entrance that is about 1.5 inches towards the bottom, and they like to be elevated about 10 feet off the ground if you can do it. In partial shade, they seem to like, and anything you can do to make this box smell like a beehive. If you got some old comb, put it in there, some propolis, or rub it with wax, dead bees, anything. And also some lemongrass essential oil. Lemongrass has citral in it. Citral is in their Nasonov gland, their orientation pheromone. And when scout bees go out, they can be drawn to that scent. And if it's the best home that's available in the neighborhood, those bees might choose you and show up. It's kind of like fishing. But I catch a lot of bees in these swarm traps every year. It's pretty fun. So that was a little bit about splitting top-bar hives. In starting them, I showed you the combs. You can take Langstroth combs and get them going. You know, for a lot of people, their only option is to start a top-bar hive is in a package. If you have a natural swarm, they're ready to go. That's how bees do it. They just rock when you put them into an empty space like that. Love catching swarms. But for a lot of people who want to start an alternative hive like this, their only option is a package. And most of these packages are shipped up from Georgia, where they get red maples and stuff. The whole package industry is based off the red maple trees down there. And these bees are just like a frame from here, a frame from there, and they're given a strange queen, and it's a bit different from a natural swarm. We say a natural swarm is kind of like you and a bunch of your friends who all have similar interests and support each other. You're going to go out and start a collective farm and grow all your own food, and it's going to be great. Whereas a package of bees is more like you and a bunch of strangers on a bus that gets stranded somewhere and has to start growing all their own food. It helps to give them some food, just to get them started. And they can pull it off. Packages do really well because they are the closest thing that we have to a swarm if you're going to buy your bees. But give food, I really recommend that people feed their bees. You know, a lot of new beekeepers don't want to treat. I think that's fine, but a lot of them don't want to feed, you know, and it's just iffy. Again, from Tom Seeley at Cornell, he gives a swarm, a natural swarm, about a 10 to 20% chance of surviving its first winter. So it's a very high selection pressure. You think of it, they have to draw all that wax, they have to raise a generation of bees that raises another generation of bees that's going to survive their first winter, and all the food that those bees are going to eat is a lot of resources. So even in a good area with a good hive and a good season, a lot of them don't pull it off. So giving them some food is going to put them on a good start and healthy ground. If you have combs of honey, that's ideal. That's what I use. When I have some extra combs, I just shake some swarms or a package of bees onto the combs of honey. If you don't have honey, use sugar syrup, you know. It's not what bees naturally eat, of course. It doesn't have the minerals, it's a different pH, but giving them a gallon or two right when you first get them is not going to really compromise their health that much. And it's going to avoid a lot of problems by trying to feed them 20 gallons of sugar syrup later in the season when they're hungry. So the way I feed a top-bar hive, the way I recommend it, is taking a 1-gallon bucket, punching some holes around the rim, flipping it over and putting it right inside the beehive and closing it up like that. Your cluster of bees is right here. You put it right with the bucket right here. It's like a chicken water. It creates a vacuum, and the bees suck the syrup. Mason jars or something like that. So if you got combs of honey, yeah, bees prefer honey. They love that stuff. But this is honey right here. So I think I'm up to harvesting. I talked a little bit about starting them, feeding them, splitting them. Honey harvest, top-bar hives. It's a piece of cake. I show up with an empty bucket and I leave with a full bucket. You know, I don't extract anymore. You know, extracting is always fun for the first hour. I spent months of my life like pushing honey through machines. It's grueling. But you know, a lot of my honey goes to cut comb squares, and the rest of it I just harvest with a knife into a bucket. I mash it up with one of these sticks. It's kind of a universal tool. And I will strain that through like a 5-gallon paint strainer bag. And that is it. You know, honeys will never spoil. It's the only food that'll never spoil. Nothing can grow in it. So that is it. It stays totally raw. And I do honey CSAs. I do like 5 weeks of varietal honeys. And, you know, since I call it treatment-free honey, I get a much better price for it. And most of my income comes from selling bees in top-bar hives or raising queens, and I market that also as treatment-free. So there's some advantages of being on a smaller scale and doing this value-added type stuff. So one of the main questions I get is how much honey do you get from a top-bar hive? I know folks up in Calgary, up in canola country, who've got 140 pounds out of one top-bar hive in a single year. But that's not really what this kind of beekeeping is about, you know, the pounds per hive average, you know. Ask not what your bees can do for you. I can start these hives through much cheaper than Langstroth's, and without the physical lifting, they're a lot easier to manage. And you know, I can keep a lot more hives in top bars than I can in just a few Langstroth hives. It's not as much work or stress on me. And more hives make more honey. And if you have more hives, you're also more resilient to the future pests and problems. If people are going to buy bees, I really recommend that they get more than one hive. You get at least 2. Your chances of success go up dramatically. You'll learn a lot more too when you're first getting going. You'll have resources to share. You know, I don't feed my bees anymore, but I will, like Robin Hood, some honey around. Rob from the rich and give to the poor. Try to keep them alive, you know. But, you know, the breeding program these days is like, just don't breed off the dead bees. They're there, they're not. It goes pretty well. And I winter them in New York. And another question is, like, how do they winter? You know, bees only move up and down. That's not true. Bees do what they gotta do. And it just takes the right bees to survive the winter. You know, like I said, I use a lot of Russian genetics. Just because I think Russian bees are the closest thing that we have to a wild bee in our domestic gene pool. I mean, they were brought over for mite resistance specifically about 12, 13 years ago. But what we've seen in Russian bees